Uh, folks can see the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm going to minimize that. Okay, so we started off the course by talking about logic, right? So the idea now is that we're going to talk about moral reasoning. So applying logic to these arguments in ethics in particular. Okay, so as usual, just stop me if you have any questions or whatever. Okay, so here's a really quick review. I mostly want to get to the Singer stuff, so we'll go through this really quickly, but if people have questions, again, just speak up. Okay, so logic, it's roughly the study of argumentation or the study of arguments or the study of what makes good arguments good and bad arguments bad, right? So what's an argument? Well, for our purposes, it's a set of statements, some of which are designated as premises and one of which is designated as the conclusion. Okay, right, so what are premises and conclusions? Well, the premises are the part of the argument that's intended to provide support for the conclusion, right? The sort of evidence or reasons given for why you ought to believe the conclusion, right? And the conclusion of the argument is the claim that the argument is an argument for, right? So we sort of define the premises and the conclusion in terms of one another, right? The premises support the conclusion is the thing that's supported by the premises or supposed to be supported by the premises. Right, they're the reasons given for the conclusion, the premises, right? And you see this sort of like circle, but this is fine because we understand the notions involved. You have to start somewhere, and these are sort of basic notions. Okay, so more review, or something like review. We can divide arguments into two kinds, inductive arguments on the one hand and deductive arguments on the other. The difference here is one of like necessitation or what the arguments are supposed to show. So inductive arguments are intended to show that their conclusions are merely likely on the basis of the truth of the premises, right? Whereas deductive arguments are intended to show that their conclusions are certain on the basis of the truth of the premises. So we can think through an example. I should have put this on a slide, but I don't think I did. So consider this argument. If this plane lands in Seoul, then it lands in South Korea. This plane lands in Seoul, therefore this plane lands in South Korea. Okay, so there's one argument. Here's another argument. Every swan I've seen so far has been white. Therefore, the next swan will be white that I see. Think about how certain you are about the conclusions of those arguments, right? Suppose the premises are true. What would you be willing to bet on the basis of the first argument? Like, how certain are you about the conclusion if the premises are true? This is the one about the plane landing in Seoul.
Pretty certain.
100%.
Yeah, good, right? You should be willing to bet your life on it. I'm not saying you should, but you should be willing to do it. But in the second one, right, how certain are you?
50%.
Okay, 50. I don't know where you came up with that number, but yeah, you're not 100% certain, right? Maybe it's more likely than not that the next one you see will be white, but it's not certain. It's not a sure thing, right? I don't know. There are black swans in Australia, right? So here I am going around North America looking at all these swans. They all happen to be white. I get on a plane, and 2 days later, I'm in Australia. And lo and behold, the next swan I see is black, right? So though I've observed, say, 1 million swans before and they've all been white, it doesn't ensure that the next swan I see will be white. Okay, so the first argument, the one about the plane landing in Seoul, right? That's a deductive argument, right? It's intended to show that the conclusion is certain on the basis of the premises, right? So if the premises are true in that argument, you can't go wrong. Whereas in the inductive or the second argument, the swan argument, this is an inductive argument, right? Making all these sorts of observations and then projecting into the future or inducing into the future, right? You can be somewhat certain, but not, 100%. Maybe you're only 50% certain, as someone said. Okay. So cool. So in this course, we're mostly interested in deductive arguments. Right? We're interested in these arguments where the premises, if they're true, right, make it certain that the conclusion is true. right? Rather than these arguments that merely make it likely. Okay, so maybe more about arguments, right? So arguments, they're not like shouting matches or fighting or, punching or whatever. They're sets of sentences or statements, right? They're supposed to give you reason to believe something, where the reasons are like intellectual in nature rather than like threatening, right? So I could say, if you don't believe this, I'm gonna punch you in the face, right? That's not a good reason. Rather, I'm supposed to give you like convincing evidence, right, in arguments. So here's sort of a question to think about, and it's maybe kind of weird, but like, how do you feel when someone gives you an argument for some claim?
Depends on the argument.
Okay, do you want to say more?
Like if it's something you're like you really believe in, then someone saying like the opposition would probably be like hard for you to hear.
Yeah, good. So sometimes it's certainly the case that it's like kind of weird and personal, right? Especially if you're like really invested in something and someone's arguing against it. I think that's true. That's happened to me before. Has that happened to other people?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay. So sometimes you meet someone who says something like, "Oh, so-and-so is so argumentative. I hate having arguments." Right? Maybe you're like that. Does anyone know anyone like that?
Yep.
Okay. So what do you or what do they hate about it?
I feel like a lot of times if there's like someone in particular who's super argumentative, they don't really have like good evidence that matches good conclusions. They just like have an opinion and they're like kind of throwing whatever they can in order to prove their point per se.
Right. Okay. So maybe sometimes when people are argumentative, they're not like actually invested in anything, right? They're just arguing to argue. Yeah. Right. And they don't really care about the truth of what they're arguing for or against, right? They're just trying to like score points or something. Yeah, that's a thing. So we'll try to avoid that. I sort of want to make a preliminary case that at least if people are arguing in good faith, right, they're giving like reasons that they actually believe. Like we should be happy when people give us these sorts of arguments. But of course, it probably depends on the type of argument, right? If they're not these good faith ones, the ones where people are giving like actual things that they actually believe, right, trying to convince you, then yeah, you probably feel kind of shitty or like put upon, or it's just weird, right? But if people are giving you arguments in good faith, right, I encourage you to take it as a sign of respect, right? They're not just telling you what to believe, right? They're giving you reasons. There's a typo there. Or wait, you're not being told what to do or what to believe, but oh no, you are being given reasons. Okay, anyway. They're giving you reasons, right? So think about when you were young, right, and your parents or guardians, they told you to do something, you might ask why, and they might say something like, well, because I told you so, right? That's super unsatisfying. Maybe it's appropriate for some children at some stage in their development, but look, we're all adults now. We deserve to be given reasons for believing things rather than like threatened or cajoled or whatever, right? They're respecting you as a knower, as someone who can know things, as someone who can reason. Right, and part of like respecting one another quite generally is respecting one another as knowers, right? If someone just assumes you don't know something, it feels bad, right? Especially if you do know it, right? Or if someone doesn't respect you as like a full adult, right? It feels bad. And one way to respect one another as knowers, right, is people who are interested in the truth or getting at the truth or like reasoning about the world, right, is to give arguments for the claims that we make, rather than simply asserting things, right, or saying like, oh, trust me, I'm an expert or whatever, right? We should be trying to convince one another, right, in good faith. Okay, and like partly respecting yourself as a knower involves believing things on adequate evidence, right? One way to do this I have written here is to be able to give reasons for one's beliefs or offer arguments for one's beliefs, right? maybe you know people who are, how to put it, really not at all curious about the world, right? And they simply believe the things that they grew up believing, right? And they have no interest in finding out whether or not those things are true. I think that's sad, right, for most people. But I think it also shows sort of like disrespect for themselves as knowers, right? Maybe they don't think of it that way, but look, they have this like big, beautiful brain, right, that they can go out into the world and like figure things out, and they're just not using it. I think that's a shame, right? So what I want to like suggest here then, for these reasons, right, this argument or these considerations I've given, right, we should feel good when someone gives us an argument, right, and we should give people arguments, right? It involves showing respect for one another and for ourselves. Okay, so one goal in this course, right, is to learn how to give and evaluate arguments for our moral beliefs. And this might sound kind of strange at this point, right? Look, I can understand giving and evaluating arguments about the way the world works, but what about our moral beliefs? Those seem like very personal, and maybe we don't have any business discussing those sorts of things. Right? Here you are in this class, and what? People are going to tell you that you're wrong about like the permissibility of abortion or whatever, any of these sorts of things that people hold very near and dear to their hearts. Right? Something about that might seem uncomfortable. I don't know. Do people have any thoughts on that? It's okay if not. Right, but as we were saying last time, sometimes people say things like, "Oh, but it's all just your opinion," right? Your moral beliefs, and there's no sense in sort of arguing with people about opinions because there's no right or wrong opinion to have. Right? In that sort of case, it would seem kind of weird to give and evaluate arguments for our moral beliefs. But what I want to talk about today, right, is sort of what that looks like and how it sort of makes sense. Okay. So to sort of get to that point, right, we're going to be reconstructing and constructing arguments of our own, right? So we're going to be looking at arguments that other people give and trying to figure out exactly what's going on in them. And we're also going to like learn and practice, or learn to and practice how, learn to and practice constructing arguments of our own, right? Giving arguments for the claims that we believe. And one sort of like little bit of mechanism we're going to be using here is what we'll call premise conclusion form. Okay, so by putting arguments in this form, we'll be more easily able to evaluate them. Okay, so this isn't like magical or anything. Really what we're going to be doing is listing the premises followed by the conclusion. Okay. But first, like, why sort of bother doing any of this? Well, I've already mentioned one reason or tried to convince you of one reason, right? I think it shows respect for ourselves and for others as knowers, right? And respecting people in this way seems to be something that's good, right? Think about how it feels when you're not respected as a knower. But also, another thing that we are besides knowers is we're moral agents. We're the sorts of things that act for reasons, right? Moral reasons. And I take it that we're all the sorts of people who value doing the right thing, right? If you didn't, I'm not entirely sure why you're in the course, except maybe it fulfills a GE or something, but I don't know. Anyway, but I'm going to take it for granted that we all want to do the right thing. But, right, it's not always clear what the right thing to do is, right? Morality's hard, it turns out. Or maybe that's something that we'll learn in this course, that it's hard sometimes to figure out what the right thing to do is, or it's hard to do the right thing when you know what the right thing to do is. But the idea here is that if we can like give and evaluate these sort of moral arguments or moral reasons, we can come to be more justified in our moral beliefs, right? The moral beliefs that we have might turn out to be correct, right? And now we have a reason for thinking they're correct. Or we might come to have correct moral beliefs or more justified moral beliefs. And when we have these sorts of beliefs, hopefully we can use that knowledge to do the right thing, right? Doing the right thing, I take it, unless you're very lucky, requires knowing what the right thing to do is. Okay, So that is, practicing giving and evaluating arguments for moral beliefs might make us better moral agents, better people, right, when we're unsure what to do, right? So maybe you'll find yourself in a situation where you're not sure what the right thing to do is. But if you practice giving and evaluating moral arguments, you might be sensitive to what the moral issues are here, right, in this unfamiliar situation, and figure out what the right thing to do is. And that, again, I think is something that we all value. Okay, so those are the sorts of arguments. I want to talk, again, this is review about how to evaluate these sorts of arguments. Again, we're interested in deductive arguments. These are the arguments where if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Or that's what they're intended to be, at least. And we'll say that an argument's valid, right, if and only if it's not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false at the same time. So think back to our argument about the plane and soul, right? That's a valid argument. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true, right? It's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false at the same time, right? That's why you can be certain about the conclusion. Okay. And we'll say that an argument's sound if and only if it's valid and its premises are true, right? So if we have a valid argument and we know that its premises are true, we can be sure, right, that its conclusion is true as well. Okay, so these are some basic notions. And again, this is all sort of review from last week. Okay, so ideally we want sound arguments for our moral beliefs. Okay, why is that? Well, we want to know what the right thing to do is, right? And if we have a sound argument, then we will know with certainty that the conclusion of that argument is the right thing to do. Right, so insofar as we value doing the right thing and knowing what the right thing to do is, right, we should value sound moral arguments. Okay. Okay, but before all that, we have to evaluate whether the argument's valid. Okay, so what's so special about validity? Again, review. We know we can figure out whether an argument's valid just by thinking about it, right? We don't have to go out and investigate the world, right? We can figure out if the premises are true, must the conclusion also be true, right? And that's what's special about validity, right? We have this sort of conditional claim. Okay, so we'll ask whether it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false at the same time. If it is, then we know that the argument's not valid, namely that it's invalid. But if it's not, right, possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false at the same time, we'll know that the argument's valid. Okay, so once we figured out whether an argument's valid, right, we'll be interested in whether it's sound, right? And to determine that, we do have to know something about the world. We have to know whether the premises are actually true, right? And to do that, right, we need to see what reasons or evidence there is for thinking that the premises are true. And this basically amounts to giving arguments for the premises as well, right? So we start off with an argument, premises, conclusion. We determine whether it's valid. If it's valid, we can ask whether it's sound, right? But then we want to know whether the premises are true, and then we're going to have to give arguments for those or evidence for those, and then we're off to the races. Okay. Okay, so here's what we're going to do, right? Determine if the argument's valid or not. If the argument's valid, determine if the premises are true. If the argument is valid and the premises are true, then we know that the conclusion is true too. Okay, so really I want to talk about Singer's argument today, right? And try to evaluate this argument and see what we can say about it, if anything. So here's how I've reconstructed Singer's argument in the paper, right? So this is premise conclusion form. So P1, P2, P3, that stands for premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, right? C1, C2, that stands for conclusion 1, conclusion 2. Okay, so I think the first part of the argument goes something like this. Premise 1, suffering from lack of food, medicine, and shelter is bad. Premise 2, if we can prevent that sort of suffering without sacrificing anything of moral importance, we, morally speaking, should, namely, should prevent that sort of suffering. Premise 3, we can prevent that sort of suffering without sacrificing anything of moral importance, right? And it's supposed to follow from that we should prevent suffering from lack of food, medicine, and shelter, right? Should and can. Okay. Cool. So let's talk about that first part of the argument. Does it seem valid to folks? That is, suppose the premises are true. Is the conclusion true?
I would say that it is valid.
Okay. Yeah, good. And when we're like considering this, we're not asking whether the premises are actually true, right? We're just asking like if they were true, would the conclusion be true? Okay. So, okay, cool. So everyone agree that the first part of the argument, P1 through C1, looks to be valid?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
The second part of the argument, or the second argument in this like really big argument, is something like this. We can prevent suffering from lack of food, medicine, and shelter by donating surplus resources. That's like the money you'd spend on coffee or whatever. Premise 5, doing so would not be sacrificing anything of moral importance. And then our second conclusion, we should prevent suffering from lack of food, medicine, and shelter by donating surplus resources. Okay. So that second part of the argument, P4 through C2, I take it that looks valid to folks.
Yeah, it looks valid.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Okay, good. Well, that makes me think that I've reconstructed this appropriately. Cool. Okay, so we have determined that the argument is valid, right, or it appears to be valid. So the next thing we want to know is whether the premises are true, right? But maybe before we do that, we can ask just questions about the argument overall. What did people think of this argument? Or better, what did people think of Singer's conclusion? What was Singer's conclusion?
Wasn't his conclusion just that we should help countries in need and we should donate to organizations that help them?
Yeah, good. That's definitely in the vicinity. Yeah, Joshua, did you want to get in on this?
Donating something of comparable moral significance. So I feel like he didn't really specify on the amount that we ought to donate. He just wanted us to be willing to give something. So I feel like that was really his argument, that even a little bit helps, no matter what the exact amount is, because everyone's income is different. So obviously everyone's not going to be able to give the same amount of resources, but giving something is what I feel like he was trying to get across.
Yeah, giving what we can.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, good. So giving what we can to help alleviate various effects of poverty. Yeah, good. And other Josh wanted to get in on this, it looks like, or unmuted.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was unmuted.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no problem. Okay, cool. So, yeah, good. So, so that's basically the conclusion, or basically what Singer wants us to do, or what he's trying to convince us to do. So, there are different ways to sort of ask what people think of the conclusion of an argument. And one thing that's nice about these moral arguments is like, oh, are you going to do it? Right? That's the question, to see what people think of the conclusion. So are you folks going to donate malaria nets or whatever?
I think in the future I will donate, but right now, being in college, it's kind of difficult at a young age to donate.
Right. Other folks?
Yeah, I feel like I would just have to get to the point in my life in which I have the means to donate. Yes. So I wouldn't say I'm there yet, but hopefully I can be there at some point.
Okay. Other thoughts?
I feel like I donate, but not that much. It's like $5-10 here and there. And like, since I am in college, I kind of have to pick and choose what to donate to because I don't have that many funds.
Okay. Other thoughts?
I think if I was like given the opportunity, then I'd be more likely to, because I liked Singer's point that he was saying if it's not much of a sacrifice, or like if it's not at all a sacrifice, then you should make the effort to donate. And I feel like that made me realize that I can donate more than I have in the past.
Right. Okay. So it sounds like most people are willing to accept Singer's conclusion, but in the future, right? When they have more. Okay. Yeah. So why not now?
I feel like Singer's argument was to donate if, like, it says without sacrificing anything of moral importance. And I feel like right now we're kind of limited on funds, like as college students.
Right.
So it kind of would be important to us right now. So, like right now I wouldn't, because it would be kind of, I don't know, a lot for me.
Yeah, I see. Okay, I think like reading all the discussion boards, all 135 of them or whatever, across 3 courses. Yeah, this was a very sort of common thought, I think. Okay. So you mentioned this notion of moral importance, Anna. What did people understand moral importance to be, or this idea of sacrificing something of moral importance?
I took it as something that would be like a significant change in your life. Like if I donated, then something significant would change in my life.
Yeah, good. Something morally significant, right?
Yes, morally significant.
Right. So if Jeff Bezos donates $1 billion or something and has to live like the rest of us, I'm not sure that Jeff Bezos has donated anything of moral importance or lost anything of moral importance or sacrificed anything of moral importance, but his life has certainly changed.
Yes, his life has changed, but he didn't donate anything of moral significance.
Yeah, or he didn't sacrifice anything of moral
Yeah.
significance. Yeah, right. Because he could live a perfectly comfortable life, like many of the rest of us. Right? Maybe not all of us, but many people who get by on, not $1 billion a year. Okay. So good. Okay. So let's sort of look at the next sort of discussion, or like discussion idea, right? So the argument appears to be valid, right? Folks agreed on that. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. Okay, so all of you, many of you seem willing to accept the conclusion, at least in the future. Okay, so that means that you think you're off the hook now. Okay, so where do you think the argument goes wrong? Right, or why doesn't the argument apply to you? So people pointed out like, oh, we're students, we're not making a lot of money, right? Is this sort of the general idea?
So I think it's just kind of a willingness thing. Yeah, I agree that the argument's true, and I understand how it could work, but kind of my thing in the that I put in my discussion board was that like we kind of, if you're like I would consider myself to just be like a regular class person. I'm not like higher class or like poor or anything like that. So I guess middle class is the word. That like we sometimes look up to other people that are in positions higher than us. So whether it be like actor or the president or whoever it is, you look up to these people, and if they're not the ones leading that change, and it's sometimes you may think, well, I can only give $100 when this guy could give 15 million, and that would make a bigger impact. So I think it's more like a leadership thing, since it's not like socially acceptable, I guess, within the United States to like donate. I don't know if it's 10 or 15%. That's not like a norm that's established. So I think, it sometimes the challenge for people to go to kind of change their way of thinking and change, and it's not that you get any blowback for going against that norm. It's just, it would be you alone. And, it may mean you're not going out to eat with your friends on Friday night as often, or you're not wearing the nicest pair of shoes or whatever. And I think sometimes people struggle with that because a lot of what it seems like we do is to keep up with the Joneses and, try to outclass people and stuff like that. So I think that would be the biggest challenge, definitely in the United States. I don't know, elsewhere.
Okay. Yeah. What do other folks think about what Kate said?
I think I kind of agree with the fact that we're always looking for someone else to sort of take initiative and start. It's easier to follow than lead. But I think even if we all decided to donate $5 a month or $5 a week or whatever we could, if we all did it, it would still add up. So even if we can't do a little bit, if we all contributed a little bit, it would add up and it wouldn't be so burdensome on people like us who don't have that kind of money,
Yeah, no, I agree with that, definitely.
Yeah, good. So maybe this is a good time to talk about the drowning child example. So what's going on in the drowning child example?
So it was talking if you're in proximity and that there's a child drowning, it's your duty to save that child, right?
Yeah, good.
If you can, if you're close or whatever.
Yeah, and it doesn't require you to lay down your own life.
Right.
Right, so this would be a case of moral significance or moral importance, right? So suppose I'm walking by a raging river and there's a child drowning, and I'm not the best swimmer in the world, and I know if I jump in, I'm probably gonna die and not save the child. Or maybe I would save the child, but I'll probably almost certainly die. Am I morally required to jump in the raging river?
I think that's hard because you're kind of deciding between yourself and somebody else, which I think your brain is automatically saying oh, self-preservation, but at the same time you're this is a kid, I need to save them. It's hard to decide, especially whenever you don't have that much time.
Yeah, it's certainly not clear cut, right? I suspect we're not required to lay down our lives to save a stranger. But that's not what's going on in this case anyway, right? In the drowning child case, right, it's just walking into the water and getting your shoes wet, or ruining your shoes or whatever, right? And there, nothing of moral importance is being lost, right? You can save a life for the price of a pair of new shoes. I don't know what are they, Yeezys? What does a pair of Yeezys run these days?
Like $300.
Yeah.
Lot.
Okay,
If
yeah.
you buy them from the store, you can get them for $150 if you get them on the release day.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, anyway, right? You could be out that much money, right, and save a child's life, and that doesn't seem like you've sacrificed anything of moral importance, right? Money is important, but it's certainly not everything, right? $150 doesn't compare to the worth of a child's life, or that's what Singer wants us to believe. Okay. So this is that sacrificing anything of moral importance idea. Okay, so one thing that I think I'm gathering from what people were saying in discussion boards and sort of here, well, actually there are two things. So one of them has to do with leadership, watching other people sort of take a stand and do the right thing, right? We tend to think, oh, well, we'll wait until someone does something. So I don't know, we can adapt the drowning child example. Suppose you're walking through the park and there's a child drowning, and you look over and there's I don't know, Elon Musk, Donald Trump, and Bill Gates standing next to the water just watching the child drown. Are you alleviated of responsibility to save the child?
No.
No, of course not, right? So morally speaking, right, it doesn't make a difference whether or not important, rich, or whatever people are doing nothing, right? That I take it is sort of a Singer adjacent point, right? So it might make a big difference psychologically speaking about what you're willing to do, right? And I take it this is part of Cade's point. But it doesn't seem to change the moral calculus, what sort of morally speaking you ought to be doing. Does this seem right to people?
Yeah, definitely the way you worded it with the river example. Yeah, that definitely kind of changed my mind a little bit.
Okay. I think, was it Gina was trying to get in on this too?
Yeah, I had mentioned that it's easier to, look to someone else for, guidance or leadership, and that it's easier to follow and say, oh, well, this person's doing it, so yeah, I feel better about doing it too.
Yeah, good. So it makes a psychological difference, but not clear that it makes a moral difference. In fact, it doesn't seem to, right? Just because, Bill Gates is doing nothing, it doesn't mean that you're off the hook, at least in the drowning child. Okay, so I take it we all agree that we should wade in and save the drowning child. Is this right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Anna is good at answering the question for everyone in a very authoritative manner. I like that. So good. Okay. Everyone agrees that we should save the drowning child in the case where it only requires ruining your new shoes. Okay, so Singer takes that case and he says, basically, there are drowning children all over the world, right? And their distance from you isn't morally significant, right? Does anyone want to expand on that idea? Sort of talk about what he's thinking there?
Can you actually explain what you mean by, like, their location is not morally significant? I don't really understand what that means.
Okay, yeah, good. Does anyone want to take a shot at this?
I think that he was trying to say that, like, with how the world is today, like, we can obviously communicate and we don't necessarily have to be in person. So the idea that, oh, I can't help someone because they're across the country or on a different continent, I think he was saying that, that's a bad argument, that we can, and even though we don't see them or talk to them or hear them, like, we can still help.
Yeah, good. So, oh, sorry, Josh.
I'd say it would be almost kind of like a unifier in the sense of like we're all human, like just because like you're from like Canada and this other person's from Japan doesn't mean like I should like help you more or less because you're from Japan or Canada.
Right, good. And yeah, good. So partly like national boundaries don't seem to matter. Joshua, I think you were saying something.
Yes. I noticed in the reading, Singer mentioned that the moral obligation to your neighbor or someone, a child across the globe, it doesn't matter. There's one does not take, I guess, more importance over the other. They're both obligations that you morally should attend to. So I feel like he was saying that there's no single person, depending like based on their geography, that should be more valued than another person.
Yeah, good. Are people, so I don't know why I'm using all these sort of religious examples recently, but are people familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan in the Bible?
Yes.
Yeah, so what happens?
I learned it when I was like
Oh,
10. So it's a bit fuzzy.
okay, so you're familiar that the story exists. Okay, so there's this guy, he's going someplace in the ancient Middle East, and he's set upon by bandits and he's like beat up and they take all his stuff. And then some like people walk by, some like important people, and they do nothing, or they cross to the other side of the street or whatever and ignore him. And then finally, a Samaritan comes along, and apparently the ancient Israelis, or Israelites rather, hated the Samaritans. But the Samaritan like takes pity on this guy and takes him to an inn, right? And gets him set up and pays for all of his treatment and whatever. Yeah, okay, cool. So what was the point of this story? Does anyone remember why Jesus tells this story? Well, he's asked a question, right? So he says something like, you should love your neighbor as yourself. And someone asks him, well, Jesus, who's my neighbor? And Jesus tells this story. And I think at least one way of reading the story, right, is that, look, everyone's your neighbor, right? So we think of neighbors or these people that we have moral obligations to as being people very close to us, but really our moral obligations sort of extend across humanity, at least very broadly speaking. Okay, so that's part of what's going on here. And it's one thing that people, talking about national boundaries and stuff made me think about. But let's think about sort of cases where distance does seem to matter. I'm not anywhere near the Oval or the Mirror Lake at the moment. Suppose, unbeknownst to us, there is a small child lying face down in Mirror Lake, drowning as we speak. Are you obligated to save the child? Well, unless you're like standing on the shore, I take it you're not, right? By the time I get to Mirror Lake, it'll be all over, right? There's nothing I can do about it, right? So this is a case where distance seems to matter morally, right? But someone, I can't remember who, was talking about like the way that the world is set up now and like donations to relief organizations, right? So it used to be the case, say, I couldn't do anything about a person starving on the other side of the world, right? I can't like ship food there because it would spoil by the time it gets there, or there's just no one to distribute it or whatever, right? But today, right, I can get online and donate to an organization of my choice, right, that has sort of the ground game there to distribute goods and services as needed, right? So who sort of falls in my moral sphere of influence is greatly expanded, right, as the world has become sort of more connected or interconnected, right? So this is a case where, someone starving on the other side of the world, the distance isn't morally significant, right? I could just as easily help them, say, as I could help someone in my own community, or perhaps even easier, right? Because in my own community, I'd have to like find the time to go to the soup kitchen and all of this. Whereas on the other side of the world, that sort of case, I can just get online and donate money. So does this help with the sort of like distance isn't morally significant case or idea?
Yeah, it makes it
Yes.
more understandable.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So this is supposed to be support for the second premise, right? If we can prevent such suffering without sacrificing anything of moral importance, we morally speaking should, right? This is the drowning child case, right? Why think that that's true? Well, because we have this sort of intuition when we think about the case that, yeah, you ought to wade in and help the child, even though you're going to ruin your shoes or whatever. Premise 3, we can prevent such suffering without sacrificing anything of moral importance. Okay, why believe that?
I think his example, like in his essay when he was talking, like if everyone donated $5, we could fix the like Bengali, like the crisis in Bengali, and like $5 to each of us is not that much. Like it's not really morally significant for us.
Yeah, good. So here's a website you can go to. It's going to give you sort of data on stuff. this is connected to like Peter Singer's organization. Can people see this? Calculate your impacts now.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can get on here and play around with stuff. Let's choose the Against Malaria Foundation. And I don't know, did anyone buy a coffee this week?
Did you say a coffee?
Yeah, coffee.
Yes.
Okay.
Multiple.
How much was your coffee?
Probably like $3.50.
Okay. Oh, that's not what I want. Oh, well, let's just say it's $3 or $4.
Okay.
Let's say it's $4. Well, did you leave a tip?
No, but it was at Starbucks, so it's a little more expensive.
Okay,
So
let's-
$4.
$4. Okay, so let's give $4 to the Against Malaria Foundation and see what it would do. Oh my God, it would purchase 2 bed nets to protect those living in malaria-stricken areas from infected mosquitoes. And it would protect, 1 bed net would protect 2 people from malaria for up to 3 years, right? So you could save 4 people from malaria for up to 3 years with your $4 donation. Okay. Question. What's more morally significant, right? Protecting 4 people from malaria for 3 years, right? Or your morning coffee?
Definitely protecting children.
Protecting children from malaria.
Yeah, right. So here's a case where as a college student, right, you could still donate and save lives, right, for very little without sacrificing anything of moral importance. Anyway, folks can get on here and look around if they want. There's some sort of interesting stuff. One thing that people were sort of pushing in the discussion boards is like, oh, I don't know where the money goes, right? How do you know that it's being used effectively? Well, here, Against Malaria Foundation, what makes it so effective? Cost effectiveness. Every dollar donated from the public is used to buy nets, right? So it doesn't go to overhead. It doesn't go to advertising or anything like that. It all goes to nets, right? And you can read about sort of how it's been used and how they've worked sort of historically, right? So if you are concerned, right, about like effectiveness, right, and that's what's keeping you from donating, well, here's some data to look at. Okay, so I want to go back to the PowerPoint. So I was going to do breakout rooms, but there's only like 10 of us, so we shouldn't. But here's a discussion, right? Does Singer advocate giving away all of your money? Why or why not?
No.
I don't think. Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
There's like at one point in his essay, he talks about like you should donate until or like as much as you can, but not so it like. I think he says, I don't remember the exact wording, but he's pretty much like donate as much as you can while still being able to provide for you and like your dependents. Yeah. So like he still wants you to be able to like live your life within like your kids or your wife, husband, whatever, but you don't need to like, he's like, instead of buying a $5 shirt, you use those $5 for like an organization.
Yeah, malaria nets or whatever. Yeah, so the sort of idea here is like you should donate up until the point where you would require aid yourself, right? But no farther, right? You're not required to spend yourself into poverty, right? Or donate yourself into poverty. Yeah, so he's not advocating giving away all of your money. Okay. But importantly, how much you ought to give, sort of morally speaking, might depend on sort of where you are and how much money you have, right? Or how many resources you have. Okay. Here's one thing I think it's sort of interesting to think about. sometimes folks will claim that they have a right to their property. Suppose that's right. I think that's very plausible. Does it follow from that that donating to these sorts of causes that Singer calls our attention to is not obligatory or not morally required?
I would say that if you live in the United States, that wouldn't be a good argument because the government takes, I don't know, it depends on who you are, but for me, they take 20% of my money. No matter what, I have no say in it. So we obviously don't have a right to that, even though we worked for it. So I'd say if we're not up in odds about paying taxes when that's just taken from us, if you have an ethical issue, you should definitely be willing to give your money away.
Okay.
Because it's actually like not all the money you give for taxes is going to save lives. If that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. What do other people think about this? I mean, here's the sort of thing that I think some folks were thinking in the discussion board. Something like this: "Hey, man," sorry, sort of sound like Joe Biden. But hey, man, I have, I made this money myself. It's mine. I should be the one who decides what to do with it. Who are you, Peter Singer or Drowning Child or whatever, to tell me what to do with my resources? Right. I think sometimes that's how people respond to this sort of argument. But even granting that you have a right to your resources, right, because you earned them, I don't think it follows from that other people don't also have a right to your resources, right? It turns out you might think that people have a right not to die of preventable diseases as children, right? And sort of allowing them to exercise that right requires other people to give some of their resources, right? So the sort of idea here is that there are a lot of different rights out there in the world, or a lot of different sort of responsibilities that we bear, right? And we have to like balance them against one another, right? So the sort of taxation example is nice, right? Because it's like, look, you might have a right to property, right, to your earnings, but also like there are all sorts of other rights that you enjoy, and those cost money, right? And there are all sorts of rights that other people enjoy, and those cost money. And the way that we're going to sort of bring it about that everyone can exercise their rights to the fullest extent possible, right, is that we need to take some property from some people and redistribute it, right, in various forms of government spending, roads, post offices, whatever. Right, so the idea is that these sorts of rights, property rights, for instance, aren't like inviolable, right? Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, that was one thing that I was sort of thinking about reading the discussion post. Okay, so sort of like final thoughts on Singer's argument. What do people sort of think about it in the end, or what do you take away from it, or what do you think is important about it, if anything?
I think his argument was actually very convincing because of how simple he made his conclusion. He supported it and he made it simple by saying, if you can prevent the bad, then why aren't you, basically.
Right. Yeah, it turns out it's very easy for many of us to prevent bad things from happening.
Right.
On this view.
It's very easy, so his conclusion was saying, like, why don't you? If it's so easy, then just help support these countries, basically.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with that point. I feel like he provided examples that weren't too complicated. He kept it very basic and said that if you are able to just do the simple things, you can make a huge change in people's lives.
Yeah, good. Is that how you found the argument convincing? Those sorts of like examples that he used?
Well, I thought it was a convincing argument, but like the part that made it realistic was the fact that he kind of simplified it. Because like I thought it was convincing, but maybe a person who's in a certain position financially might think, oh well, that's too idealistic, may not be realistic for me. He made it simple enough so that even a person who may not be on the best, I guess, level financially can still, that argument can still apply to them, I guess.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Other sort of final thoughts? Okay. Well, cool. So we'll come back to some of the issues that Singer raises, but for now, I think this is a good place to end it. So have a good weekend. I guess any sort of question or long weekend, actually. No meeting Monday. Yeah. Cool. Well, I'll see you, I guess.
Thank you.
All right. See ya.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye, folks.